Hello and welcome to our podcast on allusions. Now that's going to be allusions spelled with an A-L-L and not to be confused with illusions spelled with an I-L-L. I-L-L allusions are magic tricks, whereas the allusion we are talking about today is another one of the many literary terms that we're going to be studying this year as we work through how to analyze literature. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So first off, what is an allusion? An allusion is an indirect reference in a literary work to a previously released literary work, or it could be to a person, place, or thing in history. And so we'll explain what we mean in a little bit more detail here, but the key we want to hammer home is that an allusion is referring back to a previously released item. And so for our visual learners in the house, we can kind of see this idea here where we have, let's say, two texts. The one in the upper left has its hero's journey. The one in the bottom right has its hero's journey. If we are reading the one in the bottom right, a more current text, that's going to be the text that has the allusion in it, where somewhere in that text's hero's journey, they are referring back to a previously released text. So the one in the bottom right would be the text with the allusion in it, whereas the text in the upper left, the older text, would be the alluded to text. So again, in other words, what is an allusion? It's basically this. You're watching something, you're reading a text, and you seem to recognize a very specific scene, maybe some dialogue, a song, or a phrase that sounds like or seems like it had been in something you had seen before. And so we'll talk about the nuance here, that just because you've seen a movie that like, ooh, that looks familiar, I think I've seen this one before, that doesn't necessarily make it an allusion, but there is a better chance of it being an allusion if certain elements exist. And so again, the allusion is in the newer text, the one that was more currently published, and the text being alluded to is the original or the older text. Why do authors make allusions if they're so confusing or hard to find? Well, one is to make a connection between the writer of whatever text you're reading and then the reader. It's a way for that writer to kind of say, hey, we're on the same page, right? There's this voice from the past who has written something down and they are winking at the person who's currently reading it to be like, hey, we've built a bridge. Also, we see this a lot in children's movies, that oftentimes allusions are placed in those texts so that the adults don't get bored. A kid may be watching Megamind for the 5,000th time, and the kid is loving it because people fall down, people get knocked over, all of the physical humor. But the adults are laughing at that same movie for different reasons. They are seeing the allusions that that film makes to other older movies, to older political statements, all kinds of stuff like that. But again, a way to build the bridge of connection between writer and reader. Another reason why authors make allusions is that connection between the literal level and the figurative level of a text. So it's like a simile or a metaphor. So if an author wants to paint a character in a text as being self-sacrificing, they could use pages and pages and pages to describe how this character really gave of themselves to better humanity, how this character sacrificed themselves to help others. Or that author might be able to speed up that process by alluding back to any famous person that was self-sacrificing. And so the author might be able to make that connection quicker. And then number 3, like any of these literary terms, all of these help us figure out what the theme of a text could be. What is the author trying to teach us about ourselves, about life, about being human? Well, maybe what they are alluding to in the text helps reveal that. Why would the current author allude back to this very famous character? Why would the author allude back to this very famous politician? Why would they refer back to this other famous book? If we can notice that an allusion is happening and then perhaps bridge the gap by thinking deeply about it, it gives us another clue as to what we're supposed to learn from the current text we're reading. And so the key to figuring out if an allusion is happening is that the allusion must be an indirect reference, yet specific. If you're looking at a text now and they say, just like in Romeo and Juliet when the characters did A, B, or C, that by definition is not an allusion because it's too direct. So the current text has to be kind of vague, kind of hinting, kind of winking at the reader to say, you know what we're talking about? Yeah, we're talking about the same thing, but they need to do it indirectly. But at the same time, these allusions must be specific. For example, if you are reading a text about a courtroom and there's a courtroom scene in it, that is not necessarily an allusion to any movie or book that also has a courtroom scene in it. You can't say, oh my goodness, I'm reading this book in the current year and they are having a courtroom scene and there's lawyers battling it out to see who's guilty or not. That is clearly an allusion to this 1960s movie or this 1940s movie or this 1920s book. Not necessarily. We have to find the balance in the allusion of being indirect, but also specific. Just because there's a courtroom doesn't mean that it is an allusion to any one specific text unless it is specific enough to actually be that allusion. So here's what we mean. On the left, you have the alluded to text. On the right, you have an allusion. How do we know that the text on the right is clearly alluding back to the poster on the left? Because the poster on the right does not say, we at the New Yorker would like to allude back to a very famous World War II poster of Rosie the Riveter. They didn't say that, so it meets our indirect category. But how do we know it's specific enough? Well, you can see the arrows connecting the dots there. The blue banner of the New Yorker is the same blue as the We Can Do It. The hat color is the same on both. The yellow background is same on both. The flexed right arm is the same on both. So clearly, the New Yorker magazine, for whatever reason, and we can talk about analysis later, is making an allusion back to a very famous World War II motivational poster to encourage women to join the war effort. Once we have deduced that an allusion is happening between these texts, we could then move on to trying to figure out why. What is the New Yorker trying to say by this allusion? So how do I find allusions? This seems pretty hard. It seems like I have to know a lot of stuff. Well, number one, as always, read or view actively. We really need to engage in the text that we're reading or viewing. If we just sit back and let it wash over us, we have the potential to miss a lot of these clues that authors are giving us. So we need to agree to read actively. Number two, yes, the more background knowledge you have of texts, the better you will be able to find these allusions. If you have read a lot of texts, if you have seen a lot of movies, if you have a lot of experience in any one type of activity, your background knowledge stores are bigger. And so you might be able to see more connections as people allude to the things that you know. We will also talk about kind of the big three texts that authors oftentimes allude to. And so if you increase your stores of background knowledge in these three key areas, you are more likely to see the allusions in many of the texts that we'll be reading. And then part of reading actively is to notice clues from the text. Pay extra attention when it seems like something in your text is being compared to something seemingly not of that same text you're reading. So if you're reading happily along in the Hunger Games and they're talking about Peeta and Katniss, and all of a sudden they start talking about star-crossed lovers, you're like, wait a second, this is supposed to be some sort of dystopian novel where kids are really angry and they're forced to hurt each other in some sort of fight to the death. What does star-crossed lovers have to do with the Hunger Games? Well, that's your illusion. Star-crossed lovers actually comes from Romeo and Juliet. And so A, if you're reading actively, that will help. B, if you have some background knowledge on the concept of Romeo and Juliet, or even better, the actual line of star-crossed lovers, then you might be able to connect the dots. And then 3, if you are actively reading and paying attention and looking for clues where something is being compared that seems kind of out of left field, you have a better chance of even finding these allusions. And so like we have said throughout the year, once I have noticed that an allusion or some other literary device is happening, what do I do to interpret why the author would choose to make that allusion? Number one, you have to notice it. That's your reading actively thing. Number two, you can create a T-chart like we have talked about when comparing similes, metaphors, and that type of interpretive process. Number three, really work to understand the alluded to text what it means, and then compare that to what is going on in the allusion that you are currently reading. And then ultimately try to propose why the author would choose that allusion at that moment. And so here is that analysis T-chart that will be in our worksheets and we will use to help walk us through this process as we begin. So you can see on the left, we might have our original alluded to text, the Rosie the Riveter poster. On the right, we might have the cover of Wired magazine, a magazine about technology. And we could look at that and go, hey, that looks awfully familiar. It's a woman. She has something on her head. She is making a muscle with her right arm. This is clearly an allusion back to the Rosie the Riveter moment. So then we could fill out our T-chart to kind of figure out, well, why would Wired be doing that? What is this magazine trying to say by making their cover refer back to this poster? So down the left-hand side of the T-chart, you would really dissect the original. What was the message behind the Rosie the Riveter poster? What qualities did it have? What was the lesson? Then connect to the allusion that you are seeing there. What are they talking about? Okay, technology, young women in science and tech, etc., etc. And then ultimately we would jump to interpretation at the bottom, trying to propose meaning as to why the author of the Wired magazine would choose this picture at this time and refer back to this text. That's where we have to jump to interpretation, where there are potentially a few valid answers, but we have to connect some reasonable dots, and this chart will help us do that. So again, I get it. This sounds really complicated. Like I'm supposed to just know that the author is referring back to things. Well, what if I don't know the original text? What if I miss an allusion? Well, you might miss a clue to the author's comment, which is theme. That author might have been trying to make a very deep point by referring back to a very certain text. And if you just blow past it because you don't have the background knowledge, you might miss a clue and you might have to work harder or differently to figure out what the author is saying through that text. But ultimately, the story will go on. The book of Mice and Men is going to keep going. To Kill a Mockingbird, keep going. So if you miss the allusion, you can keep turning pages. It's not like the book stops you or something, but you might have just missed some of the depth of that text you're looking at. So it is hard to know all of the possible things that authors would allude back to. But we have looked at as many allusions as we can in the common texts that students read in high school and college here in the Western world. But we have seen that these are the big three. These are the three most commonly alluded to texts in Western literature. So if you have stockpiles of background knowledge in these three, you are more likely to see the allusions being made in the current text that you are reading or viewing. And they are simply the Bible, Greek mythology, and specifically a book called the Odyssey, and then the works of Shakespeare. So let's take a minute and just look at a couple examples of allusions in current texts that clearly relate back to these three key texts. Here we have a cartoon. Two guys are fishing. One of them leans over and says, "Moses, stop it," clearly alluding back to the biblical story of Moses parting the Red Sea. We have a political cartoon of a character seemingly slipping on water with an oil rig in the back. Again, we can connect some dots and assume that the person's slipping because they kind of look like stereotypical depictions of him. He has a halo on his head. He's wearing the stereotypical sandals, that this is supposed to be Jesus. And in the Bible, there's a story where Jesus walks on water. But in this political cartoon, he ends up slipping on the water because it is slippery due to an oil spill. So clearly, though, an allusion back to the Bible. Moving on, here's some examples from Greek mythology. And again, the more Greek mythological stories you know and the intricacies of those, the more things will jump out as being clearly allusions. We have a political cartoon talking about healthcare reform. We have IRS agents coming out of a wooden horse. This is clearly an allusion back to the Trojan horse story. Another political cartoon where we have the box saying Citizens United ruling, which was a Supreme Court case. The box has been opened and all kinds of little bats are coming out, but those bats say secret money. Okay, well, if we don't know what Citizens United is, that's okay, but it is clearly alluding back to the Greek story of Pandora's box. And in case we didn't get that from the images, the cartoonist was nice enough to actually write the words in the upper left. And then our third big text are the works of Shakespeare. So here we have an allusion to Hamlet. The key line on this cartoon is to impeach or not to impeach. And the donkey is wearing Shakespearean type clothing, and it is a clear reference back to the Shakespearean play of Hamlet, where the line is to be or not to be. And then we have one more political cartoon down there on the bottom right. We have a drawing of Sarah Palin holding up a skull, and she is saying after the election that he lost, saying, "Alas, poor John McCain, I knew him well," at the end of John McCain's presidential run. But that is also clearly a reference to a very famous scene in, again, the play of Hamlet, where a gravedigger pulls out a skull and Hamlet speaks to it and says, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well." So we could go on, and we will continue to do that in class and practice with these. But to summarize, allusions are indirect references to previously released texts, but they need to be specific enough for us to understand that this is clearly an allusion, not just a movie about a courthouse or a book with a door in it. If it is indirect, yet also specific, then you're looking at allusion. The authors make these allusions to make connections, to help reveal theme, and we as readers need to read actively, look for the big three of the Bible, Shakespeare, and Greek mythology, and really work to make connections and think deeply about why the author would make this allusion at this time. I think that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. We will practice all of these in class. If you have any questions, please bring those in. Otherwise, we will see you soon.